from the fathomless blue of the sky fell on the ground a mighty rumble, like the reverberations of a nearby thunderstorm. Two torpedo carriers passed on a shoal, soared into the sky, and immediately burst a line of large-caliber machine guns returning from a combat mission cruise saluted in honor of another victory. So, one more enemy ship with manpower, military equipment, weapons and military cargoes went to the bottom of the Baltic. Taking a walk, Ivan Feofanovich. I turned around at the voice and paused, waiting for Major Dobritsky, deputy commander of the regiment, on the political part. Grigory Vasilievich was squinting affably. I could feel that he was in a great mood. To be more precise, I am combining pleasant and useful, I answered. The commander ordered to check in the Air 1 machine from the 1st Squadron. That's where I'm going. At the same time, I want to see the airfield. Yesterday I didn't see it properly from the air. Well, that's fine. So we're on our way. I'll go to the first one too. What's the weather, Ivan Feofanovich? It's like summer back. Summer is not summer, but the days are long. It's a sin to complain. Indeed, the middle of September, 1944 in the Baltic was happy with newly established warmth, cloudless sky, almost complete absence of wind. The green width of the airfield, covered with white and purple flowers, was fragrant with the aromas of autumn grasses. Along the perimeter of the airfield towered beautiful birch and pine trees, reliably hiding our planes from enemy aerial reconnaissance. There were gasoline refueling trucks, in a hurry to fill the aircraft tanks in time with fuel, outwardly leisurely, but dexterously moved people, technicians and mechanics hung torpedoes, bombs, mines, brought ammunition for machine guns. Now and then the silence exploded with the roar of engines, and a thick bassy echo roamed the neighborhood. For a long time the technicians were trying out the engines. The airfield left a good impression, and not only because it seemed somehow home-like, cozy. The main thing, it had a runway that meets the requirements for the operation of torpedo carriers with a full combat load. At the end of the runway was made deep ploughing, created catchers in case of termination of takeoff or failure of brakes at landing. Hitlerites, retreating, badly damaged the flying field. And now in many places among the greenery there were black splotches of fresh earth, traces of buried funnels. I see that our comrades from the construction battalion had to work hard, I noticed. Yes, it's not easy to prepare a disfigured airfield for operation, agreed Grigory Vasilievich. Effort, of course, spent a lot, but we coped quickly and, importantly, well. Very well. Well done. Nothing to say. He knew how to see good deeds, our deputy. He was able to see the brightest in people. He could not only see, but he was able not only to see, but to note, to highlight it, to show it to everyone. We knew each other for only 2 months, but somehow we became friends. It happened by itself, without any effort on either side. I noticed that both pilots and technicians treated Grigory Vasilievich with unfailing respect. And there was no phenomenon here. The clue lay, as they say, on the surface. Fatherly, caring and sensitive to people, he always knew their needs and aspirations. With anyone found a common language, able to come to the aid in time, to help in a difficult moment, to give advice. Each of his words came from the heart. That was what bribed the listeners, disposed to him. On this airfield Klopitsi, in the western end of the Leningrad region, our 51st Mine Torpedo Aviation Regiment was relocated only the day before. This redeployment became simply necessary. The recently launched offensive of the Leningrad and Karelian fronts, with the active support of the Red Banner Baltic Fleet, was successfully developing, and our former airfield in Novaya Ladoga was at a considerable distance from the areas of combat operations. Now, when assigning combat missions to pilots, the maritime communications Riga-Tallinn, the Gulf of Riga, the islands of the Munzund archipelago, the mouth of the western Divina, the Abensky Strait, were mentioned more and more often. The war was rolling westward. It should be noted that by the middle of September the aviation of the Red Banner Baltic Fleet had grown considerably in its composition and was fully aimed at sea objects. With the commissioning of 51 MTA-P, the main strike force essentially doubled. The number of supporting forces was also doubled from the Black Sea, where the war was practically over. An attack air division was relocated here, to the Baltic, and the number of fighter aviation increased. Now our efforts were distributed in the following way. The 1st Mine Torpedo Aviation Regiment, which had previously operated near us, was relocated to one of the liberated airfields near Vilnius and acted on communications and the southern part of the Baltic Sea. The waters of the Gulf of Riga and the Gulf of Finland remained under the control of our regiment, and here the combat work did not cease neither day nor night. Using every opportunity, we made torpedo bombing strikes on enemy ships, carried out mine-laying. Day crews were replaced by night crews, who were allowed to fly day and night in any conditions without any restrictions. Later, analyzing this period of the war, our military historians will say, the KBF aviation in 1943 took the leading place in the actions on the enemy's sea communications. The effectiveness of its strikes on enemy ships increased 7 times in 1944 and 11 to 12 times in 1945. From the second half of 1944 until the surrender of Nazi Germany, the main burden of the struggle on sea communications fell on the CBF mine torpedo aviation and attack aviation. They will also calculate that the CBF mine torpedo aviation destroyed almost 1.5 times more enemy transports and warships than bombardment and attack aviation. During the conversation, Major Dobritsky and I quickly crossed the airfield and came to the location of the 1st Squadron. I confess that I was, to put it mildly, not quite attentive and not quite courteous interlocutor at times. Twice I had to interject and apologize. Grigory Vasilievich, in his usual manner, pretended that he did not notice or did not pay attention to my inattention. He understood that my head was not occupied with our idle chatter about the Indian summer in the Baltics, but with thoughts about the upcoming flight. I have already said that he was able to penetrate into the concerns and thoughts of people with whom he was brought together by fate, and I could not help thinking about the flight, as always, mentally lost. All my actions from takeoff to landing, so maybe sometimes I answered him inappropriately. No, I was not new to aviation at that time. Since I graduated from the Kharkov Military Pilot School in October 1933, I went through all the stages of flight practice. I was a junior pilot, senior pilot, a squadron commander, instructor in theory, and technique of piloting, squadron commander, deputy regimental commander. I have plenty of experience. I had a chance to fly all types and brands of airplanes, which in the past 11 years were in service with our Soviet military aviation. But the American A-20J and A-20 Do, or simply Boston, on which the 51st Mine torpedo aircraft flew, I had to master already here in the regiment. And although for 2 months of my stay here, I had more than 80 sorties on this airplane, the sense of responsibility did not leave me. I knew dozens of pairs of eyes will watch my takeoff and landing. The crew will evaluate my actions on the route, and did I have the right, deputy commander of the regiment for flight training, to fly worse than others, to allow even minor errors and blunders, which are sometimes characteristic of yesterday's graduates of the school, only recently taken in the hands of the helm. It makes you think. I have heard that an artist ceases to be an artist if the upcoming meeting with the audience ceases to excite him. I think it's the same for a pilot. After all, every flight is a small discovery. It is something different from the previous ones. And how can one remain indifferent? The airplane was ready for departure. The technician tried out the engines, and they hummed bassily and evenly. On the green-blue varnished hull, here and there, grey fresh patches, traces of holes received in previous flights. Monoplane, having an unusually wide fuselage, a kind of flying tank, Boston more like a transport plane than a combat aircraft. But the Americans considered it an attack aircraft, although, as practice showed, was not adapted for combat. Operations at low altitudes, insufficiently high speed, poor maneuverability, low safety margin, and, most importantly, the lack of armour and front navigator's cabin made it very difficult to pilot it in poor weather conditions in the Baltic and very vulnerable to anti-aircraft artillery fire, especially small caliber and automatic. And, frankly speaking, we have always envied the pilots of our domestic Armadillo II, in the very design of which was laid care of air fighters. Nevertheless, the Boston torpedo bomber in the hands of Soviet people became an obedient and formidable weapon. Our craftsmen in the field aviation repair shops installed on the aircraft holders for torpedoes, as well as aircraft bombs weighing 250, 500 and 1,000 kg, Torpedo launching and bombing were carried out by pressing a button on the pilot's helm. If for some reason the electric launch did not work, the dropping could be done by pressing the lever, the cable from which led to the holders. Solid fuel reserve and speed up to 525 km/h, allowed to search for naval targets and combat operations at a sufficiently large distance from the basing sites. The torpedo carriers were armed with 9 large-caliber machine guns, 4 fixed in the nose of the fuselage, 2 also fixed, aimed forward, were located in the planes. Fire from these and others led the pilot by pressing a button on the steering wheel. In the cockpit of the gunner radiator, located behind the center wing, on a rotating turret was strengthened twin installation. And finally, another large-caliber machine gun was intended for firing from the lower hatch, which was especially necessary when repelling attacks of enemy fighters from the lower hemisphere, as well as to suppress enemy firepower when the aircraft passed over the target. It should be noted that our aviators skillfully used this considerable firepower of the aircraft. And now the runway is a solid grey-green ribbon swiftly carried back. The airplane shakes solidly and elastically on the unevenness of the track. I add gas and smoothly take the helm. Boston easily pulls away from the ground. With Grigory Vasilievich Dobritsky we live in the same room. In the evening, in the light of the carrier, powered by a rumbling engine behind the wall, covered with brochures, newspaper clippings, reports of the Sovinform Bureau, he makes some notes in his notebook, perhaps sketching theses of tomorrow's conversations with people, and I at such times try not to interfere, not to distract him with conversations. The man is working. Who knows? And suddenly at this minute the combat history of our regiment, or even the whole aviation of the Red Banner Baltic Fleet, is being born. Out of the corner of my eye I look in a selection of reports of the Sovinform Bureau. On July 18th, pilots Presnyakov and Ivanov discovered and sank an enemy transport of 10,000 tons displacement in the Baltic Sea. On July 19th, a torpedo-bearing aircraft of the Red Banner Baltic Fleet torpedoed and sank an enemy transport of 4,000 tons displacement. On July 20th, pilots of the Red Banner Baltic Fleet sank a transport of 3,500 tons displacement in the Gulf of Finland. On July 21st, pilots of the Red Banner Baltic Fleet sank 3 CR. Serious damage was inflicted on other vessels. On July 25th, aviation of the Red Banner Baltic Fleet in the Baltic Sea sunk a transport of 7,000 tons displacement and a patrol ship. I don't read further. These reports are too dry and monotonous. But I know that these clippings are just for memory, for conversation starters, that in tomorrow's conversation of Major Dobritsky with young pilots these protocol reports will come to life, will be filled with living content. The heroics of torpedo bearers' firing routine, the hot breath of battle, the readiness of people to overcome fear, to despise death for the sake of victory over the enemy. And revealing one of these reports, our deputy commander will surely tell about that memorable flight. Then air reconnaissance found in the Baltic Sea caravan of enemy ships going to Libava. The crews, which were in a state of high alert, received the task for the flight. The leader of the group was Senior Lieutenant A.M. Gagiev, the wingman was Lieutenant P.A. Poroknia, both pilots with torpedo. The torpedo attack was supported by hero of the Soviet Union Senior Lieutenant I. Kesako, famous for his daring topmast attacks, and young but brave and talented pilot A. E. Skryabin. The planes took off one by one at exactly 17.00. They were immediately taken under guard by the fighters of Lieutenant Colonel P. Pavlov. The route lay to the west of the Lithuanian town of Šiauliai, where the front line passed. It was flown at a glide camouflaged by the tops of birches and spruces. Not a cloud in the sky. Good visibility made the attack more difficult. It allowed the enemy to detect the planes on the approach and deprived of the possibility to attack suddenly. Meeting with the enemy caravan, as expected, occurred in the specified area. In the keel column were 3 transports. On the starboard side, one at the head and one at the tail of the column, they were guarded by 3 CRs. Gagiev decided to attack the end transport, the largest. Attack the entire group from the sun side in accordance with the usual tactics widely used in the regiment. At the command of the leader attack, Sachko and Skryabin increased engine speed, broke forward and rushed to the caravan, taking on the oncoming fire of ships. Following them, reduced to a height of 30 meters, went into the attack torpedo bearers. Fascist pirates scattered, opened frantic shooting. All ships were firing. In the air formed a continuous grey-black curtain of bursting anti-aircraft shells, cut by multicolored beams of tracer bullets, Oerlikon German automatic small-caliber anti-aircraft guns. Many shells were bursting in close proximity to the aircraft, but there were no direct hits. The enemy anti-aircraft gunners were hindered by the sun, and the pilots all the time skillfully maneuvered. Opened fire and large-caliber artillery ships, which hit the course of the attacking aircraft, raising above the surface of the sea huge columns of water, meeting with which threatened torpedo bearer inevitable death. The Nazis tried in every possible way to repel the attack or at least force the pilots to go to disadvantageous for the attack course angles. But the planes, sharply maneuvering, rapidly approaching the enemy. Finally came the decisive moment. At maximum speed, Sachko and Skryabin at low altitude dropped each 4 250-kilogram bombs. High walls of water soared at the sides of the attacked ships. At this time, Gagiev and Poroknya approached the caravan at a distance of half a kilometer. Throw-it commanded the radio leader, and in the air, huge silver fish shone 2 torpedoes. According to the observation of the crews, a large Nazi transport of 1,000 tons displacement, shaken by the explosions, began to quickly settle at the stern and soon sank. None of the planes of the Gagievsky 4 was not injured, except for the numerous bullet holes and shell fragments discovered later by technicians and mechanics. Gathering after the attack, the group marched in close formation toward their airfield. Their leader, rocking his yak from wing to wing, congratulated the torpedo bearers on the victory. The meeting on the ground was also joyful. Pilots, technicians, motorists, officers of the headquarters and services of the regiment embraced the winners, shook hands with them. This is what stood behind the dry lines of the report of Sovinform Bureau. The Russian proverb, a mountain and a mountain do not meet, but a man and a man always contains deep folk wisdom. Meetings, however, are different. Some are soon forgotten, leaving no marks in the memory. Others, on the contrary, sometimes become a notable milestone in life, enrich spiritually, equip with knowledge, help to build a future life. Now, looking back into the past, I think with satisfaction that fate has not spoiled me with its attention, and I was lucky to meet many good people. Then, in July of 44, having arrived in 51 MTAP, I, as it was customary for military men, introduced myself to the regiment commander Major VM Kuznetsov. The conversation was not long. We knew each other from our previous service in the Pacific, and the commander was in a hurry. He was called to the Air Division headquarters. "Well, start performing your duties," he said. "In the evening, when everyone will be in place, we will introduce you to the personnel. Meanwhile, look around, get acquainted with our economy, with people." I went to the airfield. Pilots, navigators, technicians were standing in groups near airplane shelters. I approached the nearest one, introduced myself, and just when the conversation was starting to establish, someone behind me put his hand on my shoulder. I turned around, and the words froze on my lips. "Ilya, are you really you?" "Did you recognize him?" "Wow," he said, squeezing me in his arms. "To us, then? Glad to see you, my friend, very glad." "Me too. I didn't expect to see you. How long has it been since we've seen each other?" In fact, how much unstoppable time has passed since in April 1932 we both got on special recruitment of the Central Committee of the All-Union Communist Party to the detachment of cadets at the Kharkov Aviation School, and there together mastered flying. Ilya Ponomarenko then became the squadron foreman, and I became the secretary of the party organization. From the first days I felt a deep sympathy for Ilya. He was youthful, hot, cheerful, fighting. It was felt that he had found his calling and would never stray from the path once chosen. Ilya's character was a great attraction. His views rested on firm convictions. If there were any doubts, he did not hide them in himself, shared them with his comrades. And for this in those years you needed a certain courage. He argued, defending his beliefs, and in matters of principle he was irreconcilable. He did not tolerate lies, hypocrisy, boasting, was not afraid to honestly say in the eyes of a man everything that he thinks about him. He liked to tease his comrades, but having an enviable sense of humour, he easily accepted jokes in his own address. As they say, a mountain with a mountain. He smiled, hugging me by the shoulders, and everyone who was around quietly retreated, not interfering with the meeting of old friends. "Look, you're already a major." "And you too." We both laughed. "Well, tell me." After graduating from the school, the commander's fate scattered us in different directions. A year later, I had a chance to serve in the aviation of the Pacific Fleet, from where I have now arrived in the Baltic. Ilya Ponomarenko's military service was different. He already had to fight. It turns out that even during the Finnish-Soviet conflict, he led groups of bombers into battle. Then he was an inspector of the Air Force of the Baltic Fleet, deputy commander of the 1st Guards Mine Torpedo Regiment for flight training, and now on the same position in the 51st MTAP. That's it. Wait a minute. So I've been appointed instead of you. I was feeling a little out of place. That's right. And I, Comrade Major, am charged with the formation of a new combat-ready aviation unit, he jokingly said. And for a moment it seemed that in front of me again our former detachment petty officer. The same open face with protruding bumps of cheekbones, the same direct look of large, squinted eyes not without a slayness. It is not by chance that I am telling so much about this man. Later on I appreciated how immeasurably much he did for the combat training of the regiment, in order to make yesterday's graduates of aviation schools, 20-year-old youths, to forge a real air fighters, fearless and skillful torpedo bearers. Yes, what's to say, for those few days that we had to stay in the regiment before his departure to a new place of service, he spared no effort or time for my torpedo education. It was Ponomarenko explained to me the essence of topmast bombing, which in our regiment was first introduced into practice among other regiments of bomber aviation. This method is used only over the water surface against warships and enemy transport. Top is a small platform, the highest point on the mast of the ship, at a height of about 30 meters from the water surface. Hence the name. Descending to this height, the topmast plane approaches the target at a distance of 200 to 250 meters and drops a series of bombs weighing 250, 500 or 1,000 kilograms each. The bombs, hitting the water surface, ricochet and, continuing to move by inertia, hit the side of the ship. If you successfully drop a series of 4 bombs, at least 3 will hit the target. And another positive property, the explosion occurs not on the deck, where the greatest armor, and below the protective belt and even under the bottom, in the most vulnerable place for the ship. Topmast bombing is much easier than the combat launch of a torpedo. That's why all young pilots in the first combat sorties took bombs, and when they gained some experience, became shelled air fighters, got the right to fly with a torpedo. And it was Ilya Neofitovich who several times took me out to the training range to learn the skills of topmast bombing. For a lot of practical advice on training young pilots, I am eternally grateful to Major Ponomarenko. As I learned later, the creator of topmast bombing in the Baltic was a talented flagship navigator of our regiment, one of the best specialists of the KBF Air Force, Major Grigory Antonovich Zavarin. When the 51st MTAP was formed, it was him, a former navigator of the 8th Air Brigade, who was entrusted by the Fleet Command with a difficult and responsible task to prepare pilots and navigators for combat operations in torpedo-bearing aviation within a short period of time. A man of great culture, deeply intelligent, sociable and very attentive to people, he from the first meeting disposed to himself. He successfully combined strictness and kindness, the qualities necessary for a true educator. Moreover, he was strict and demanding first of all to himself, because he worked as if not knowing fatigue, and sometimes one had to wonder when this 7-limbed man rests. For 9 months, in view of losses, the regiment was formed twice. On replenishment most often came from schools newly graduated pilots and navigators, who knew about torpedo aircraft only by hearsay, and others, and the sea in their lives have never seen. Grigory Antonovich patiently taught them the theory, flew with them at any time of the day to perform tasks and achieved that in the shortest possible time they were transformed, if not into aces, and then at least into mature specialists capable of flying day and night in difficult weather conditions of the Baltic. It was not by chance that, to paraphrase a popular song of the time, the regiment sang. Don't rely, pilot, on the weather, but rely on your airplane. You will destroy the enemy from the get-go if your navigator doesn't let you down. But navigators did fail. Major Zavarin did not ignore any such case. No, not at all, in order to publicly take a chip off the guilty. He scrupulously analysed the actions of the pilot and navigator, helped them with leading questions themselves, or with the help of comrades in the squadron, but it is better still to discover the error. He was sure, and life confirmed it, that all those present, having found themselves after such a detailed analysis in a similar situation, would henceforth act without error. I remember that the crew of Lieutenant P. A. Shilkin, having flown out on a free hunt, did not find enemy ships in the sea. Since it was strictly forbidden to land at the airfield with bombs, the crew bombed the previously scouted backup target in the Estonian town of Paraveri. And then both pilot and navigator lost orientation, dodged the route and made an emergency landing on one of the airfields near Novgorod. This case served Major Zavarin as a reason for a thorough conversation with young pilots and navigators. He demanded the most thorough visual study of the flight area. Understand, he said, flying at low altitude with poor visibility, and where the terrain is monotonous, having no characteristic, pronounced landmarks, requires very accurately know on the route, and in the area of the airfield, literally every point, every bush. At any point of the route, navigator must unmistakably determine the location of the aircraft. Of course, telling about Major G. A. Zavarin, it was impossible to ignore this huge part of his work training and education of aviators. The practice of using aviation to strike at sea convoys convincingly showed that the tactics that existed at the time, the combat order of bomber aviation, cannot be mechanically transferred to the aviation torpedo bearing. Outdated cannons, tied torpedo carriers, embarrassed us as embarrassing clothes embarrasses a young man who grew out of children's pants. This was the result of various reasons, and first of all, the changing situation on the enemy's sea communications. When Hitler's transports were still travelling alone, without the cover of warships, the success torpedo bearers often brought and single cruising flights, the so-called free hunting. But since the spring of 1944, due to the victories of the Soviet army on the land fronts, the Baltic Sea ceased to be the internal sea of Nazi Germany. If recently, just a year ago, German transports were carelessly walking with running lights on, now the picture had changed dramatically. Groups of transports were under the strong guard of warships and fighter aviation. There was nothing to think about attacking a single plane or even a link. Now the torpedo carrier to attack became possible only after the suppression and dispersal of enemy anti-aircraft artillery fire, especially small-caliber automatic installations. Near the coast and in the bases, this task was successfully solved by attack aircraft. When torpedo carriers had to attack the convoy in the open sea, the IL-2 radius of action was insufficient. It was necessary to change the tactics of combat use of torpedo carriers, to look for new opportunities, other ways to suppress enemy anti-aircraft defences at sea communications. This is where the analytical and creative capabilities of Major Zavarina, who worked tirelessly together with Major Ponomarenko on the development of new tactical options, in full glory. It was a union of two talented aviators, masters of torpedo bombing strikes, who passed the harsh school from its very beginning. When the airfield, at least a little bit of combat tension subsided, gave free time, they sat for long hours in a smoky room flagship navigator, analysing the successes and failures of past sorties, and in the dim light of smoky smokestacks, drew out all sorts of options for combat order torpedo carriers, agreed and argued, torn and discarded sketches to immediately draw new ones. Sometimes they were briefly joined by Major V.M. Kuznetsov, or Chief of Staff of the Regiment Ivanov, came in one of the squadron commanders each, offered something of their own, something that was firmly rejected, or accepted for further discussion and verification, and gradually crystallized the contours of the new tactics, a new combat order of torpedo carriers. Since remoteness from the airfield does not allow the use of attack aircraft to suppress enemy anti-aircraft guns when attacking the convoy, the only way out is to use for this purpose their own aircraft topmost of Ikami. Yes, the crew of the topmast plane was the first to take on the full force of the fire of warships, as well as transports, on which the Germans installed automatic guns Oerlikon, which had a high rate of fire. It is difficult, without seeing with his own eyes, to imagine all this fiery hell in which the commander of the topmast of it should, without flinching, throw his plane. But there was no other way out. No matter how much they thought, no matter how much they drew, no matter how much they argued, there was no other satisfactory solution. Only topmastmen, skillfully maneuvering, could fire their large-caliber machine guns and bombs to suppress enemy anti-aircraft fire or destroy the guard ships, and thereby ensure the exit of the next torpedo carrier to deliver a decisive torpedo strike. Such tactics forced to change the battle order, and although until the end of the war the standard unit in the mine, torpedo aviation, still remained a 3-aircraft formation, we acted in a 4-aircraft formation, 2 torpedo carriers and 2 topmastovikami. So was born this tactic, this scheme approved and more than once justified in the subsequent heated battles at sea communications. And until the victory we remembered with gratitude its creators, our comrades in arms Grigory Antonovich, Zavarin, and Elia Neofitovich Ponomarenko. I will allow myself once again to deviate from the chronology of my narrative and again turn to the past days, because I simply have no right not to tell about one of the brightest pages of the combat history of 51 MTAP. The participation of our torpedo bearers in the sinking of Hitler's air defense cruiser Niobe. It was the first large warship destroyed by us in the Baltic during the Great Patriotic War. How did the events develop? But first briefly about the situation of those days. In the summer of 1944, Hitlerites urgently strengthened their positions on the islands and the northern coast of the Vyborg Bay in order to preserve their main bridgeheads. On a small area of the coast they concentrated about 60 artillery batteries. In the Hapazar Skerries there were more than 30 enemy ships, and on the airfields near the Finnish port city of Kotka was based aviation group, mainly fighters. Ships damaged by our aviation were also pulled here for repair. Quite naturally, Hitler's command began to feverishly strengthen the air defense of the area. For this purpose arrived in Kotka air defense cruiser Niobe. Fleet air reconnaissance immediately detected the appearance of such an important guest. The Soviet command decided to destroy the cruiser. However, the first strike, made by the 12th Bomber Regiment, was unsuccessful. Planes dropped 70 bombs of different caliber. In the port there were many fires, but the cruiser remained unharmed. It was not possible to repeat the strike immediately. A few days there was bad weather. The staff of the Fleet Air Force, headed by General Etherharin Suginin, began to develop a plan for a repeat operation. They tried to take into account the mistakes of the first raid, summarized various opinions on the use of not only bombers, but also other forces and means of fleet aviation. It was expressed, for example, the proposal to use to attack the cruiser torpedoes. The proposal looked, at first glance, tempting but was not feasible. Why not? The depth where the ship was anchored did not exceed 10 meters, and the torpedo, when dropping it from an aircraft, dives to a depth of 20 meters. Consequently, the probability of hitting the target was reduced to 0. Preference was given to topmast gunners. If the bomb does not even hit the side of the ship, but explodes under it in contact with the ground, then Niobe will get a lethal dose of metal, especially since in the underwater part of the armor he had no. We decided to use Fab 1000. There were no larger bombs. After a comprehensive assessment of the situation, formed the final scheme of the operation. As the main strike force attracted 4 aircraft of our regiment in the version Topmastoviki, on board each 2,000-kilogram bombs, leading Lieutenant Colonel I.N. Ponomarenko. Involved also 33 bombers from the 12th Regiment. 6 of them had to fly out without bombs and only simulate a blow, diverting anti-aircraft fire during the attack Topmaskovikovki. The rest of the Petyakov had on board high explosive bombs weighing 100 and 250 kilograms, leading the commander of the regiment hero of the Soviet Union, Lieutenant Colonel V.I. Rukov. The operation was supported by 27 L-2 airplanes, their task small bombs, rockets, cannon and machine gun fire to suppress the fire of anti-aircraft artillery of the enemy to create conditions for the main forces to attack. It was also allocated 48 Yak-9 fighters from the 21st Regiment under the command of the hero of the Soviet Union, Lieutenant Colonel P. I. Pavlov and La 5 from the 1st Air Division. After careful analysis, discussion and coordination determined the following order of operations. The decisive blow is to be struck exactly at 17:00 hours. The task of scouts once again to clarify the parking place of the cruiser Niobe. Then, 10 minutes before the decisive strike, 24 La 5 fighters would fly to the area of Kotka to clear the sky of enemy fighters. 5 minutes before the strike of dive bombers of the 12th Bomber Regiment, attack aircrafts of the 11th Aviation Division under cover of fighters suppress anti-aircraft fire in the port of Kotka and on nearby islands. From 16:50 to 16:55 dive bombers attack. Exactly at 17:00 make the final blow top Mostaviki. Simultaneously imitates a blow 6 looping without bombs. Strike groups of P2 go to the target from different directions. The topmast pilots make the approach from land, at low altitude, camouflaged by folds of the terrain. The plan of the operation and the schemes of interaction of all the units involved in it were developed by the headquarters of the Fleet Air Force so clearly that in the process of accomplishing the task did not need to make any adjustments. The morning of July 16th. In the staff room all night spent leading a group of topmast pilots in Ponomarenko and navigator of his crew, flag navigator of the regiment Georgia Zavarin. They were preparing for a detailed study of the task with pilots and navigators of the crews participating in the operation. It was very important to foresee, clarify, check and agree everything. Time was running inexorably fast, and already the first slanting ray of the sun peeking out from behind the horizon broke through the window and lay on the maps spread out on the table. It wouldn't hurt to take a nap, Ponomarenko suggested, stretching with pleasure. It's going to be a hard day. With rest, my dear, nothing will work. Zavarin looked at his watch and answered. Soon the officers will be here. According to the plan, they should come only in 2 hours. You're wrong, Ilya. That's according to the plan. But wait for them any minute now. If you and I, the old air wolves, are worried before we go on this mission, the rest of us are not. Zavarin looked like he was in the clear. Squadron Commander Captain I. V. Tikhomirov. V. Tikhomirov, pilots Sako and Shilkin with their crews came much earlier than scheduled, but they did not enter the command post, silently waiting at the entrance. Everyone became animated when the commander of the 8th Air Division Colonel and Sukhanov arrived, and with him the commander of our regiment Major Kuznetsov and Chief of Staff Captain Ivanov. The regiment commander set a combat task, then carefully discussed the future actions of each crew in flight, especially when approaching the target, during the attack, and when leaving it. Clarifying the task, Colonel Sukhanov emphasized. I especially draw your attention to the strict adherence to the time of attack. This element plays a very important role in the close interaction of so many aircraft. Do not forget about anti-aircraft maneuver. The air defense in the Kotka area is very strong. Sukhanov asked pilots to share their thoughts on the upcoming operation. All crew chiefs spoke out. The conversation was mainly about where it is better to come from to attack the cruiser. We came to the conclusion that it is most appropriate not from the bay, and through the city, at high speed, clinging closely to the roofs of houses. After working out the task at the control room, crews got time for rest, which was especially needed Ponomarenko and Zavarin. Then everyone gathered at their airplanes, where once again everything was clarified, checked and agreed. Before the flight, we and Chief of Staff Ivanov approached Ponomarenko's car. The gunner radiator was already sitting in his seat, and the commander and navigator about something near the stepladder. Are you worried? I asked Ilya. I am, he admitted. His excitement only before the helm, Zavarin grinned. As soon as he takes it in his hands, he becomes like an iron. We took to the air exactly at the appointed time. First Ponomarenko, followed by Lieutenant Shilkin, then Lieutenant Tikhomirov with Lieutenant Sako. The roar of the engines, moving away, became silent somewhere near the horizon, and with it the indistinct feature of the last airplane melted away in the sky. An anxious silence hung over the airfield. There were no other departures expected at that pre-dawn time, but no one left the airfield. Pilots, technicians, mechanics gathered in groups, briefly exchanged a couple of words, and kept silent. There was no conversation. Mentally, each of us was with those who flew to the mission. Together with them experienced what could happen on the route and at the time of the attack. "They're flying," shouted, finally, someone. The first airplane appeared, followed by two more. Ponomarenko, Tikhomirov, Sachko unmistakably identified the landed planes standing next to the technician. No Shilkin. I silently looked at Ponomarenko coming out of the plane. "The task was completed," Ilya said briefly, "but we lost Shilkin's crew." He wrinkled his nose bitterly, waved his hand and went to the headquarters. Only in the evening, when the crews a little withdrew, when the first excitement fell, Ilya was able to get out of Ilya skimpy details of the past battle. Well, the route was strictly on schedule. Niobe, as intelligence reported, stood on the eastern roadstead, afloat, but with a roll. Nearby a large transport and more than a dozen of all sorts of port trifle schooners, boats, motorboats. I gave the command over the radio going to the target. With me Shilkin, Sachko and Tikhomirov to attack the transport, developing maximum speed. We were detected. From the ground, from the ships rushed towards us a sea of anti-aircraft fire. Sharp maneuvering, throwing the plane from side to side. I keep the cruiser on the course angle of 90 degrees of the left side. I drop the bombs from a minimum distance. Both exploded in the central part of the cruiser. On the way out of the attack, I turned around and saw a terrible picture, the wreckage of Shilkin's plane falling into the water from the smoke cloud. The machine exploded. Apparently, a direct hit of an anti-aircraft shell. Tikhomirov and Sachko also saw the moment of death of their comrades, and as if avenging for them, struck with high precision. Maneuvering, Tikhomirov brought the topmast truck to the transport and decisively attacked. From the explosion of 2,000-kilogram bombs, transport broke in half and immediately sank. Sachko attacked the cruiser. One of his bombs blew up the aft part of the ship. Flying away, the pilots watched as Niobe slowly sinking into the water. Our 3 bombs had done their job. "Why did the cruiser stood with a lurch?" I asked. Worked Petlyakovi. Lieutenant Colonel Rakov and his boys did their best. The blow of Ponomarenko's topmasts became decisive. The operation showed excellent organization of interaction between all types of aviation. Flawlessly, for example, performed their task fighters of the 21st Regiment and the 10th Air Division. Although raised in the air a lot of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, they were unable to break through to our strike groups. It was a good organization of interaction allowed to minimize the effectiveness of enemy anti-aircraft fire. We lost 1 crew. The attacking dive bombers had no losses. The next day, Sovinform Bureau published a report on the great victory of the KBF pilots. In particular, it said a group of bombers of the Red Banner Baltic Fleet under the command of Guards Lieutenant Colonel Rakov and Lieutenant Colonel Ponomarenko attacked enemy ships in the port of Kotka. As a result, the German air defense cruiser Niobe was sunk. The plane under, and Tikhomirov sank an enemy transport of 6,000 tons displacement in the port of Kotka. By the decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR from July 22, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel Ivan Vasilievich Rakov was awarded the Second Medal Gold Star. Our topmast pilots Lieutenant Colonel Ilya Neofitovich Ponomarenko, Captain Ivan Vasilievich Tikhomirov and Senior Lieutenant Joseph Kuzmich Sachko were awarded the high rank of Hero of the Soviet Union. Other participants of the operation were awarded orders and medals. A rally was held in the regiment. Pilots, technicians with great joy honored the first heroes of the regiment, wished them new victories over the hated enemy. There are people who somehow quickly and imperceptibly become close to you, like good old acquaintances. It is easy and simple to communicate with them. Such a person should live in any collective for a day or two, and he is already his own man, and it is even hard to imagine how they could do without him until now. Such was Senior Lieutenant Iosif Sachko, a slender, always neatly trimmed boxy blonde with blue eyes. With his appearance, the room seemed to explode with jokes and laughter. But here Joseph took a guitar in his hands, and everyone instantly fell silent. The guitar in his hands came to life. It suffered and rejoiced. It wept and laughed. Joseph knew many Russian and Ukrainian songs. It seemed that his repertoire was inexhaustible. The Variag was fading. The Cossacks were on their way began. Everyone sang along. The song flowed wide and freely, like a river in a flood. And then, as if a shadow came over the singer's face, and he began heartfelt sadly. The sea is wide open. Only the waves are raging in the distance. And everyone listened in silence. No one sang along. No one dared to enter the singer's Holy of Holies. What memories, what associations did his favourite old song about the bitter fate of the stoker bring to him? Most likely at these moments he mentally transported to his native Dneprodzerzhinsk, where his childhood and youth passed, where he first heard and learned this song, where his mother and sister remained, the factory where after school he worked as a crane operator in the new rolling shop, the aero club that gave him a ticket to the sky. A carefree joker on the ground, Joseph transformed in the air, became serious, focused, calculating. He had a lot of courage and bravery, and there was no need to talk about flying skill. And it was not by chance that his crew always participated in all the most important operations. When the regiment was reorganized, Iosif Sachko's crew was transferred from us to the 1st Mine Torpedo Aviation Regiment, and soon from there came the sad news on August 27th, 1944, the crew of the hero of the Soviet Union Iosif Kuzmik Sachko did not return from a combat mission. The commander and his combat friends, Navigator Junior Lieutenant N.N. Baigozin and gunner, Radiator M.M. Izumov were killed during the attack of enemy ships off the coast of Estonia. Bitter. Painful. It's hard to believe. For a short month of our acquaintance I managed to love him, and to be attached with all my heart to this boy who never got discouraged. And now he was gone. Preparing material for the story, I visited the hero's relatives in Dneprodzerzhinsk. A beautiful, wide and green street in the center of the city is named after him. Several expositions in the city museum are dedicated to him. The pioneer group at the school, where he studied, bears the name of Iosif Sachko, and the new rolling mill workers of the Dzierżyński plant permanently enrolled former worker Iosif Sachko in their staff. The memory of heroes does not die. The relocation of the regiment to the airfield Klopitsi coincided with a change of leadership. Major V.M. Kuznetsov left for a new place of service, and Major F.A. Sitikov took command. Fyodor Andreevich was not new to the regiment. He participated in its formation, and then became deputy commander for flight training. However, he did not have to do his immediate duties at that time. Major Sitikov was assigned to organize and lead the transfer of combat aircraft from Krasnoyarsk, where they came from America, to Leningrad. Installation, the pilots used to call it among themselves, is not an easy thing. To accept unfamiliar machines, to select crews, squadron commanders and squadrons for them, to establish technical service on the spot and during the route. All this could be entrusted only to a comprehensively trained pilot with a great experience of work with people and qualities of an outstanding organizer. There were not many intermediate airfields on the route from Krasnoyarsk to Novaya Ladoga. Some of them were far from each other, so even a slight deviation from the route threatened big trouble. Pilot transporters, engineers, technicians, motorists, which these American Boston, and in the eyes of the eyes have not seen, trained on an accelerated program in the reserve regiment at one of the airfields in northern Kazakhstan. From them, and selected Major Sitikov the right number of crews and technical personnel, with them successfully conducted the first run, and then some more. And now Fyodor Andreevich is back in his native regiment, but now already in the role of commander, and my meeting with him is also the second. After graduation from aviation school, he was assigned to the Pacific Fleet and joined the squadron, where I was deputy commander and was engaged in commissioning young pilots. Among them was Lieutenant Fyodor Sitikov. Now we sort of switched roles, but it did not prevent us from being genuinely happy about the new meeting, learning to quickly understand each other and work, as they say, hand in hand. True, we did not have so long to serve together, but about this later. With the last replenishment in the regiment joined 6 crews of former ferrymen. So formed from them, the 3rd Squadron immediately became noticeable in the regiment. and it was headed by Captain Konstantin Alexandrovich Meshcherin, a fine pilot, a participant of the battles with the White Finns. Even then he was awarded the Order of the Red Banner. The ferrymen, junior lieutenants, also in general green youth, were ahead above their peers, yesterday's graduates of schools. They had already flown a little. At the distillation they had to 10 to 12 hours a day not to part with the steering wheel. Pilots had a good command of piloting techniques and navigators airplane navigation. Now they mastered the combat use of the aircraft, and the rest had to master the other. But everyone had the same thought in his head: it would be sooner to fight. I remember, I once came to the pilots, crowded together in the shade under the wide wing of the Boston. Junior Lieutenant Valentin Sokolov, a red-haired, ruddy, stout man, recently appointed deputy commander of the 3rd Squadron, gesticulating animatedly, told the pilots who had come to us from the Livanevsky school. ... How many reports were written refusal and refusal and refusal. And this time everything was as usual, continued meanwhile Sokolov. There was another ferrying. We received the cars, inspected them properly, and quietly went to spend the night. About 9 in the morning we were awakened by the duty officer. They call us to the headquarters. Well, let's go. It was a usual thing. We always gathered the crews before the flight. We were given a task. They conducted pre-flight preparation with us. We picked up maps, laid out and calculated the route, filled in the flight documentation. And then look, something's wrong. In addition to the ferryman, the entire flying staff of the base gathered in the headquarters. It was already unusual, and the superiors behaved strangely. Time was passing, but they did not appear. Employees of the headquarters every now and then ran with papers in their hands in the room to the commander, then to the chief of staff. Apparently something agreed. Finally invited everyone to the meeting room, a large empty room. The regiment commander came and announced a group of our comrades is going to Leningrad. The flight is tomorrow morning. It is necessary for everyone to prepare thoroughly. We were expecting something special, but here, as usual. After all, everyone had flown to Leningrad more than once. The commander looked at our stretched faces and continued after the distillation. All of you will stay together with the airplanes at the front. Hurrah, we shouted. At last it had come true. At last we had waited. Perhaps someone wants to stay on as a ferryman, the commander asked. No, no, we mutually bellowed, afraid lest he change his mind. No one wanted to stay. And those who that time did not get into our group looked enviously at us, the lucky ones. Sorties, torpedoing, bombing and mine-laying sorties. I would like to note that we carried out mine-laying missions until the end of the war. They were among the main tasks which were solved by the regiment throughout its combat activity. In the Gulf of Finland and the Gulf of Riga, in the mouth of the western Divina, on the communications Vindava-Tallinn and Riga-Tallinn, the combat work did not stop day or night. The crews of Captains V.A., Merkulov and I.V., Tikhomirov, Senior Lieutenant I.K., Sachko and others were allowed to fly in any meteorological conditions without any restrictions. They were experienced, already shelled crews. They were respectfully called old men in the regiment. One could recognize them even by a special gait. To an unsophisticated person it could seem that they were slow and too important. In fact, this solidity stoicism was developed as a result of their self-confidence, the ability to do their work intelligently, without fuss, clearly, correctly, and on time. They were strangers to manifestations of weakness, nervousness. The most difficult task they perceived as ordinary were able to come out with honor from the most unpredictable situations. All our young people envied them, and some of them, imitating the old men, wore their flight tablets in the same way on one shoulder, on an incredibly long strap up to their heels. What to say, of course, old men were the pride of the regiment. From mouth to mouth, as a legend passed on to the pilots, for example, an episode from the combat biography of pilot Merkulov. Once he, together with navigator Captain A. I. Renzaev and gunner radioman, Petty Officer Y.A. Volkov flew at night to lay mines on the entrance fairways of the port of Tallinn. Above the target, the airplane came under heavy anti-aircraft fire. The machine received a direct hit. The shell pierced the center wing, damaged the gas tank and oil tank, but fortunately exploded in the air. Inside the plane, The gasoline vapors filled the air. There was nothing to breathe. Visibility was completely lost. The airplane was poorly obeying the rudders, catastrophically losing altitude. It seemed that death was imminent. But Merkulov managed, leveled the plane almost at the water, and, taking advantage of the fact that through the holes in the hull and open Renzaev lower hatch, pulled out some of the vapors of gasoline and became at least something visible, masterfully landed the machine on a patch. Tiny island Lavansari. Under normal circumstances, no one would have thought of landing a heavy airplane on this too small, unadapted site. And he did. Boston stopped 4 meters from the edge of the cliff. I am sure that young pilots listening to this story involuntarily wondered, and if I had the chance, would I have been able to do the same? Laying magnetic mines is an effective means of fighting against enemy ships. We made a flight by a single plane, a pair, or even a link with such a calculation to appear over the target in the darkest time. Everything depended on the conditions on the route, and mainly in the target area. To divert from the aircraft destroyers of the attention of the enemy air defense, simultaneously bombed strikes on important objects in the immediate vicinity of the mine-laying sites. This gave positive results. Naturally, that for night bombing was selected. Not only well-trained, but also unusually brave, truly fearless pilots. After all, the task of the bomber was no easier, if not more difficult, than the destroyers. He called on himself the beams of searchlights and anti-aircraft artillery fire, and was near the area of mine-laying, served as a live target until all the destroyers did not leave the target. During the summer period, taking advantage of the white nights, the regimental command attracted to mine-laying and young crews. In this saw a certain amount of risk, but there was no other way out. The old men were not always enough. However, the risk was justified. The most capable of young pilots and navigators were gradually drawn into night flights, quickly mastered the skills of airplane navigation in total darkness. Mine staging forced the enemy to reduce naval transportation, and although Hitler's command had considerable forces and means for trawling, enemy losses on mine obstacles were very tangible. It is noteworthy that in the Baltic the German losses from mine weapons more than twice exceeded similar losses in other maritime theatres. It is estimated that out of 6 ships and transports destroyed, 1 died on mines. On September 4, 1944, Finland declared its withdrawal from the war, and later, on September 19, an armistice agreement was signed with her in Moscow. Thus, by the time of our relocation to the airfield of Klopitsi, the theatre of combat operations of 51 MTIP was considerably narrowed. This allowed to pay more attention to cruise training, to achieve a high level of flightability, to work out a clear interaction according to the scheme born in the regiment: 2 torpedo carriers, 2 topmast carriers. In those days one could hear such reports of the Sovinform Bureau: during the past 24 hours nothing significant happened on the Leningrad front. The scouts were active, separate battles were of local character. But it was the calm before the storm. A grandiose offensive of the Soviet army was being prepared for the liberation of the entire Baltics at night. Divisions and regiments were being pulled up to the front line. New equipment was arriving. The fate of Soviet Estonia and its capital, the port city of Tallinn, the main base of the Red Banner Baltic Fleet, was being decided. Before the decisive battles, it was necessary to thoroughly study the situation and terrain in the area of the regiment's operations in the western part of the Gulf of Finland and, most importantly, on the communications Riga-Tallinn, Vindava-Tallinn. For this purpose, on September 13th, the regiment commander Major Sitikov flew on a combat mission. The crew included flag navigator Major Zavarin and the chief of the regiment's communications, Senior Lieutenant P. M. Cherkashin. And on September 14th, I flew out with navigator Captain Renzaev and gunner radioman, Petty Officer Yevgeny Volkov. On the same day, air reconnaissance detected on the distant approaches to Tallinn enemy transports, escorted by warships. Major Sitikov made a decision: 2 airplanes to conduct additional reconnaissance, to clarify the coordinates and then call by radio the main group of planes to deliver a decisive blow. In the air raised the crews of the deputy commander of the 3rd Squadron Junior Lieutenant V. M. Sokolov Torpedo, M. Sokolov Torpedo Bomber, and the commander of the Link Junior Lieutenant M.V. Nikolaev Topmast Gunner. It was their first combat sortie, their first face-to-face meeting with the enemy. Alas, it ended tragically. In vain at the airfield, crews were languishing near the aircraft waiting for the signal to start. The pair took off as in water vanished. And when anxiety and worry for comrades reached the top point, Nikolaev's plane appeared. It landed awkwardly, rolled into the parking lot, and everyone saw that there was literally no living place on it, so it was riddled with bullets and shrapnel from anti-aircraft shells. The wounded navigator N.I., Konko and gunner radiator I.F. Ivanov were taken out of the rear cabin. Later on, Nikolaev's story was able to reproduce the picture of the battle. Sokolov, having found the convoy, forgot that his main task to call the main forces rushed into the attack. Nikolaev had nothing to do but follow him. In the fervour inherent in youth, Sokolov completely discarded everything he was so diligently taught, did not even bother to properly assess the situation, did not miss forward topmostovik, and attacked first, straight ahead, and against the sun, thereby complicating the task for himself and facilitating it for the enemy. Before Nikolaev's eyes, Sokolov's plane exploded in the air from a direct hit by an anti-aircraft shell. Nikolaev's bombs sank a large transport, but the machine received so much damage that the pilot barely made it to the airfield. The ridiculous, unjustified death of our youngest comrade was painful in my heart. Major Dobritsky then told that shortly before the flight, Sokolov, in the circle of comrades' bravado, his courage, said that bowing to bullets will not be, and no matter what the fire to the side, will not turn away. Empty, boyish bravado. How dearly it cost him. But this case seemed to sober us, the elders, once again reminded that at the helm of torpedo carriers yesterday's boys, many of whom are barely over 20, that we need to convince them that reckless prowess has nothing to do with real courage. Scared of anti-aircraft fire, turn aside, not to fulfill the combat mission, it is cowardice bordering on crime. But if a pilot, turning away from flying towards the fire traces, performs an anti-aircraft maneuver, no one will doubt his courage. In spite of everything, he stubbornly approaches the ship and makes a torpedo or bomb strike that is military valor, true courage. We tried to find simple words, to make conversations not formal, to talk more often face to face. And, I must say, our grains fell on fertile soil. Most of the young pilots had gone through a good school in the Komsomol, and some of them already carried in the pockets of Blue Navy tunic candidate cards, and even party tickets. And for the whole history of the regiment, I do not remember any more cases of reckless boyishness, dashing prowess, not to mention cowardice. On the contrary, I remember, the day after Sokolov's death, another pair of ours from the same 3rd Squadron discovered a convoy at sea, a torpedo bomber, a squadron commander, Junior Lieutenant A.A., Bogachev, and a topmast gunner, also a squadron commander, Junior Lieutenant D. Bashayev. The transport went under strong protection of warships. Hitlerites bristled with an avalanche of barrage fire. Nevertheless, Bogachev decided to attack the transport. At his command, Bashayev went forward and dropped bombs on the guarding ships, suffering a lot from bullets and shrapnel. Following him, Bogachev went to attack with a torpedo. Approaching at the required distance, he pressed the button of the electric ejector on the helm and did not feel the usual at this jerk of the aircraft, which at such times, as if jumping up, freed from gravity. Commander, the torpedo did not go. Almost simultaneously reported over the intercom navigator GP, Stefan and gunner radiator V. I. Vanchugov. Obviously the electric wire was broken by a shrapnel. There was no time to resort to the mechanical reset. The transport was smoking thickly under the very wing, obviously increasing its speed. I know. I see, Bogachev muttered glumly in reply. With a left roll he was leaving the convoy in a wide arc, intensely beating out foamy whiskers with his propellers, and he felt uncomfortable at the thought that the transport could get away so easily and with impunity. Far ahead of him, Bogachev's airplane, which was going eastward, could be seen as a black dash on the horizon line. "Let's go in again," he said firmly. "Vanchugov, keep an eye on the messers." "I'm watching, Commander." Now he went into the attack alone. Topmostovik no longer cover him with the fire of his machine guns, will not blind the gun crews with bomb blasts. Thousands of fire trails stretched to the plain from all the ships. How many of them? How to slip, how to seep in this deadly stream. A strong blow shook the machine. The left engine smoked. The plane pulled to the left. Dover at rudders, Bogachev levelled Boston, at right angles directing to the rapidly approaching grey side of a low sitting on the water steamer. It's time. He pulled the lever of mechanical reset and entered the left turn. Got it, exclaimed Vanchugov soon joyfully. Yes, Commander, we got it. While moving away from the target, Stefan recorded on the photographic film a sinking transport of 7,000 tons displacement. Its nose was sinking into the abyss, and at the stern the propellers were wasting air. Bogachev focused all his attention on piloting the plane. The left engine stalled, and listening to the right engine, working for two, the pilot thought only about the fact that it did not fail. He kept correcting the course with the rudders, and although the machine was still yawing, they were slowly but surely pulled toward their airfield. A large area of the tail feathering, which seemed a hindrance in high-speed maneuvering, now served a good service, keeping so necessary now the stability of the aircraft. And soon after landing, Bashev and Bogachev returned from a combat mission another pair, torpedo bomber Lieutenant V.M. Borisov, who became after the death of Sokolov deputy commander of the 3rd Squadron, and his wingman topmastman Lieutenant S.P. Pudov. In the area of Gogland Island they discovered and attacked an enemy minesweeper. It was noted that bombs hit the ship. The sinking was counted not quite reliable because it was not possible to fix it on the photographic film. The first flights after the regiment was reformed were hard for us. With such a strong opposition of the enemy, the slightest inaccuracy or mistake in the actions of the crew led to unfortunate consequences. But it was also a good school. A school of battle hardening, a school of courage. On September 17th, the troops of the Leningrad and First Baltic Fronts, in close cooperation with the Red Banner Baltic Fleet, launched a decisive offensive in the general direction of Tallinn. Over the airfield all day and night, the hum of engines did not cease. If before that only crews of the 3rd Squadron, former ferrymen, flew on combat missions, now by the order of the regiment the crews of the other 2 squadrons were also admitted to combat work. Pilots, technicians, mechanics worked with full dedication, each striving to make his personal contribution to the victory over the enemy. And among the many events of those days was one, which right should be told in detail. On September 18th, the crew of Junior Lieutenant Gusman Miftakhodinov did not return from a combat mission. That day 2 of our planes, the leading torpedo bomber A, Bogachev, and his wingman G. Miftakhodinov met the enemy convoy on the communication Vindava Tallinn and attacked it. As usual, the topmastman took the lead, but immediately the machine shuddered from a strong impact, the left engine stopped. To lighten the machine, Miftakhodinov dropped bombs. They fell with a large underflight, causing no harm to the ships. And when, losing speed, the bombed plane passed by the patrol ship, a deafening blow was heard from the other side, and the speed of the right engine decreased noticeably at once. The machine poorly obeyed the rudders, inexorably descending to the lead grey waves. What to do? The pilot pondered feverishly. Go to the shore. But they're the Nazis, it's a shore captivity. No, not that. So pull as far as possible, try to land the Boston on the water. Miftakhodinov had heard that German ships after the battle fished out floating people, and especially hunted for our pilots from the shot-down machines. Therefore away, as far as possible from the enemy convoy. Prepare to land on the water, the commander ordered on the spew. And he suddenly became timid, never had to land on the water landplane. How will the machine behave? How long will last on the water? He did not know this, and no one had ever told him about it, because in the regiment no one had ever happened to anyone like that, and the steel-cold waves, covered with frothy lambs, were inexorably approaching. From a sharp jolt the pilot hit the dashboard and lost consciousness. Alexander Bogachev also attacked to no avail. He, apparently, was knocked off balance by the unsuccessful attack of the topmastman, and he did not expect to meet such an intense fire from all the ships at once, or maybe distracted by anxiety for the wounded wingman, but the only time Alexander failed, he dropped the torpedo a little earlier than he should. The captain of Hitler's transport saw the foamy trace of the torpedo rushing to the board and had time to turn away. Commander, Our wingman landed on the water, reported the navigator. I see. The pilot, dissatisfied with himself, replied dryly. We will pass over the place of landing, but we will not make a circle, so as not to alert the Nazis. Landing at the airfield, Bogachev, as always short, without unnecessary words reported on the results of the combat flight. In general, a day of total failure, he waved his hand and, seeing off a couple of planes taking off, nervously rubbed the strap of the tablet. The navigator reported the exact coordinates of the landing of Miftakhudinov's plane. Just on the active communications of German convoys, looking at the operational map, bitterly remarked the Chief of Staff, Captain Ivanov. Look, Riga Tallinn, Vindava Tallinn. The traffic is like on the avenue. It's a pity the guys will be lost for nothing. What we need is a seaplane. At least one for the whole regiment, damn it, at least a small one. And Miftakhudinov's crew was fighting for life. Having received the commander's order to prepare for landing on the water, Navigator Junior Lieutenant Gleb Lokolov and Gunner Radio Sergeant Yuri Aksenov began to unfold a rubber rescue boat. A sharp jolt threw them against the cabin wall. Lokolov painfully hit his left hand and badly damaged it, either a fracture or a sprain it was impossible to determine at once. Fortunately, Alexei had only slight bruises and was the most active during these minutes. He threw the rubber boat on the flat and helped Lokolov, who was moaning with pain, to get out. And to the horror of both of them, before their eyes, the canisters of the automatic filling of the boat with air, which for some reason turned out to be unfastened, slipped off the plane and instantly disappeared into the depths. Yuri rushed to the mech, connected the hose to the boat, began hastily pumping air manually. How much longer would the machine stay afloat? He felt how the airplane was going out from under his feet, inexorably settling down, and pumped with his last strength. He was helped by Miftakhudinov, who, having plunged into the cold water, came to his senses. Guys, soon? Lokolov, swimming nearby, called out in a weak voice from time to time. Boston, tilted on the bow, went under water, and they were left unsupported, alone in the open sea. Thankfully, all three of them had life jackets that worked well. Dusk was approaching when Miftakhudinov and Aksenov, exhausted, finally inflated the boat. They picked up the freezing Lokolov out of the water. Swimming in the Baltic Sea in the second half of September cannot be a pleasure. All in exhaustion reclined back on the elastic rubber boards, giving up their small boat to the will of the waves. Everyone was thirsty, and only now they remembered that in the turmoil they had forgotten in the airplane and emergency rations, and a flare gun with rockets. To be fair, it should be noted that soon after this incident in the Red Banner Baltic Fleet appeared boat seaplanes. The very fact of their appearance was a weighty moral incentive. The crews now knew that if they were shot down over the sea, they would not be left to chance, they would definitely be found and picked up, which happened many times later. On-board rations and rocket launcher with rockets began to pack into the rescue boat. Darkness fell on the sea, and with it came a cold northern wind. Soaked uniforms, which had nowhere and nothing to dry, were tight around the body and caused painful sensations. Miftakhudinov and Aksenov took up oars. They rowed as hard as they could to keep warm. Lokolov, supporting his aching arm, tried to stop shivering. Orienting themselves by the polar star, they rowed northwards towards the Finnish coast. There, only there, was that straw which could still be grasped. However, in the Finnish skerries it was not safe either. Although Finland had concluded an armistice with the secular Union and its troops did not fire at our troops, there was still a lot of fascist scum on the territory of the country, the meeting with which did not bode well. Quiet, quiet, guys, Lokolov exclaimed in a loud whisper, peering into the night darkness. I hear, it seems, the noise of ships. Gosman and Yuri quieted down, raised their oars. They could hear the water dripping off them, tinkling. And in this tinkling, getting stronger and stronger, came the distinctive murmur of the engine of the patrol boat. But the night sheltered them securely, and soon the sound died away. Before dawn the wind increased, the waves became higher and steeper, and the rubber boat was tossed about like a splinter. The spiky crests were slamming over the side. They tried to scoop out the water with handfuls, but it did nothing, because the next wave nullified their efforts by adding more water than they could scoop out. Boots came into play. Even Lokolov, overcoming the pain, tried to help, but working with one hand, almost dropped his boot. And Miftakudinov said, "All right, Gleb, don't. We'll do it together somehow. You'd better hold the fur and oars so that they don't wash away." The dawn crept up, and the wind suddenly died down. The waves decreased and no longer swept over the side. Torn wisps of fog drifted over the boat. It grew thicker and gradually covered everything around with a dense canopy. It became quiet and silent. They huddled together in the middle of the boat, warming each other with their shared warmth. Miftakudinov closed his eyes and immediately seemed to sink into another world. It seemed to him that he was walking through his Lubyanka forest in his native Tatarstan, and on his way there were hogs, aspenberries, butterberries begging in his hands, and his basket was already full, and he had nowhere to take them, and it was a pity not to take them. He bends down, stretches out his hand, and the vision disappears, and before his eyes a milky veil of fog. Suddenly Lokolov woke up, listened. "What are you doing?" Miftakudinov asked. "It seems to be rumbling again." They listened. No, quiet. Every soldier who has been in battle knows that silence in war can be scarier than the most furious attack. It's oppressive, frightening in its unpredictability. They also realized that this fragile silence can at any moment explode with the crack of a patrolman's engine, gunfire and death. What if we run into the Germans? Aksionov spoke aloud the question that each of them had had in his mind since the moment when their Boston clumsily plunged into the water. "We all have 1 gun and 16 cartridges," said Miftakudinov cheerfully. "That's enough for the first case." Why, after the emergency landing, only the pilot had the gun, it was not possible to establish. When flying on a combat mission, everyone had a pistol in a holster on his belt. 13 for the Nazis, the last 3 for us, picked up Aksionov. "There will be no captivity, at any rate," whispered Lokolov with inflamed lips. "Komsomol members do not surrender," summarized Miftakudinov. "Well, if the commander spoke slogans, it means that our ship's combat readiness is number 1. Aksionov could not resist teasing. And everyone smiled at this joke, or rather at the fact that all of them had come to the same decision without collusion. They were ready, without hesitation, to share the same fate, and, having realized it, became even closer and more dear to each other. By noon the fog cleared, rose higher, and then disappeared altogether. The sun warmed up, and the hope of getting warm and drying their uniforms awoke. All around them stretched a silent, deserted sea. They were alone in this immense space, where there was nowhere to hide, nowhere to hide. Now an encounter with an enemy ship or boat might prove fatal. Having warmed up slightly, they dozed off, or maybe they simply fell into oblivion. Miftakudinov was suddenly awakened. It seemed as if he heard children's voices. The voices were indeed nearby, but they were seagulls. They flew in circles above the boat, landed nearby on the water, and then rose and flew to the north. "It means that the land is not far away, if the seagulls," suggested Miftakudinov. The navigator and the gunner nodded in agreement. They did not want to talk. Already in the evening everyone heard the noise of engines and became wary, but they realized that the noise was coming from the sky. There, in the blue sky, there was an air battle. Skittish fighters converged and diverged on gentle and steep turns. Came short lines of machine gun bursts. Aksionov could not stand it, shouted, "Here, here. Where are you going?" "Calm down, Yura," reluctantly said Miftakudinov. "They have their own worries. They have no time to look at the sea." The merry-go-round of aerial combat shifted to the south, and then disappeared into the distant blue, taking with it the noise of engines and the flicker of hope. Indeed, try to see a tiny rubber boat in the vast width of the sea. And everyone remembered for the umpteenth time the rocket launcher forgotten in the airplane. Like sentries at the post, Days and nights changed in a half-delirious forgetfulness, and every next day increased thirst and hunger. A bar of chocolate miraculously found in the pocket of the gymnospare's tunic of a frugal gunner radiator. They fed the wounded navigator, breaking off a small piece of chocolate. On the fourth day, Aksionov, unable to resist the temptation, scooped up a handful of seawater, took a sip and immediately began to spit up. Yuck, what a disgusting thing. Oh, damn you. Don't, Yura, Lokolov dissuaded him in a weak voice. Don't drink. I read somewhere that seawater makes you even more thirsty. The same day airplanes appeared again. First, at different altitudes, 9 of our fighters passed from the Finnish shore in links of 3. And then, pressing the roar of the engines, 2 such native Bostons passed very low over the boat. All 3 of them rose from their last strength, shouting and throwing up their helmets. Miftakhodinov even thought he saw the number 23 on the rudder. It's Bogachev. Or did it seem so? The torpedo bearers disappeared behind the low horizon line, and soon distant explosions were heard from there. Ours are fighting, said Miftakhodinov, not without envy. Don't hang up your nose, guys. We'll fight with you too. We'll live to see the day when there won't be a single fascist bastard left on earth. The Bostons that appeared and disappeared like visions stirred my soul. They're flying, Sashka, beating the bastards, and I. Miftakhodinov executed himself with envy for Bogachev. That's how he got through the same wall of protective fire. He got through. Why were we shot down? So he knows how to maneuver, but I don't. Maneuver, maneuver, and maneuver again. He remembered the instruction of the regimental commander and flag officer, and he just couldn't wait to sit at the wheel immediately right now and prove to everyone that he would be able to outmaneuver the enemy and win. He wanted it so badly that, from frustration, from his own powerlessness, he even groaned. What are you doing, Guzman? Do not worry, wheezed Lokolov, who guessed the anguish of the commander. I believe in you. Let's get out of this mess. You and I will show ourselves. By the evening of the 5th day, a dark, vague strip appeared in the darkness. There was no doubt it was the shore. The boat was being carried towards it. Miftakhodinov and Aksionov kneeled down, stretched out on their outstretched arms the worn-out, shaggy, wrinkled commander's tunic. Even under this improvised sail the boat went much faster, but there was no strength to keep the sail 5 days without food and water did their job. I think the motor, Commander, do you hear? Aksionov was worried, and indeed, approaching, the rumbling of a boat engine was growing, and immediately the tall bow of a wooden schooner floated out of the shore shadow. Miftakhodinov grabbed his holster, but Lokolov touched his arm. Wait. It looks like the fishermen are. At the command post of the regiment, Major Sitikov asked me to the operational map and, circling a point on the liberated part of Estonia, said, You will have to fly here, Ivan Feofanovich. Finnish fishermen picked up Miftakhodinov's crew. Yes, the guys are alive, but they've been exhausted for 5 days. They're here at this airfield. Meet them, caress them, cheer them up, and bring them here. As soon as we landed, 3 strangely dressed men rushed from the wooden airfield hut to the airplane. We involuntarily became wary, and Volkov, as he told us later, even deployed the turret of his twin gun. But the 3 came closer, and we recognized our missing, who were considered dead. Instead of the usual Navy uniforms, which were so torn that they had to be thrown away, the Finns dressed them in their own, which confused us at first. Miftakhodinov, putting his hand to his headdress, tried to report in full form, but nothing came out of it. Tears flooded his eyes, joyful excitement seized his throat. We embraced and kissed, both of us rejoicing. It was the first time I had seen this strong-willed, and, as it seemed before, self-confident strong man so confused. We hugged the others as well. I looked at their faces and marvelled at the changes that had taken place in them. And not only exhaustion and inhuman fatigue were the reasons for it. The boys were not the same as a week ago when I saw them off. From yesterday's boys they turned into life-smart men who looked death in the eye and did not give up. They were real heroes in front of me. Did they liberate Tallinn? They asked, when the first excitement had subsided. We liberated it. Miftakhutinov kept lamenting that he couldn't save the plane and reach the airfield. Nothing. The main thing is that you are alive, and you will have a car, I reassured him. At the home airfield, all members of Miftakhutinov's crew, whom they had never expected to see alive, had a cordial meeting, and they were convinced how strong and unselfish front friendship is, how many sincere combat friends they have, on whom they can always rely. Interrupting and complimenting each other, they told about those unusually anxious and difficult 5 days and nights, about their ordeals and their friendship, and then the ambulance took all 3 of them to the hospital to be treated, to recover their strength. I reread the written about these glorious guys and realized that I have no right to limit myself to this, to put a point without telling about what happened to them further. Therefore, at the risk of again coming into conflict with the chronology of my narrative, I will allow to look a little ahead. So, on November 22, 1944, by regimental order, Lieutenant Miftakhudinov's crew was again allowed to fly combat missions as part of the 3rd Squadron. However, it was slightly modified. Sergeant Yuri Aksenov remained the gunner radiator, and Lieutenant A. Skripnik was appointed navigator of the combat aircraft, as Gleb Lokolov was still recovering in the hospital with a fractured arm, and again Gusman, at the helm of a combat aircraft, like all pilots, did not spare himself. A great success fell to his share in the battle on December 14th. On that day, paired with Lieutenant M. Borisov, he made a daring raid on the port of Libava and sank an enemy transport of 8,000 tons displacement. Despite the strong opposition of the air defense of the base, he perfectly completed the combat mission, for which he received a high government award, the Order of the Red Banner. Back then, on the boat, Gleb looked into the water. "We'll still fight," Miftakhodinov said, trying not to show the joy that was bursting out of him, but as if by accident he kept squinting his eyes at his chest, where on the blue cloth of his tunic a brand new order was shining with gilt and bright enamel. But not long he was able to show off with the order on his chest. Exactly 1 month later, on January 14th, 1945, we received a report of aerial reconnaissance of the enemy convoy detected far out to sea at about the traverse of Memel. I made a decision to strike with a group of 4 airplanes, leading Deputy Commander of the 3rd Squadron Lieutenant M. Borisov, his wingman Lieutenant V. Kulinik, leading the 2nd pair of Linkai, Repin, wingman Junior Lieutenant G. Miftakhudinov. I set them a task, made sure that they understood it, and allowed to go to the aircraft. Stocky, in a fur flight suit and unties, Miftakhudinov looked like a bear cub from afar. He was gesticulating animatedly and saying something to Aksenov and Lokolov, who had recently returned from the hospital. The flight tablet on long straps was beating on his ounce right. Taking into account his combat merits, it was not a sin to enroll Miftakhutinov in the old men. Near the Caponia the engines were humming properly, and Basily, the technician of the airplane, had warmed up and tested them in advance. Seeing the pilot, he wanted to turn off the ignition, but Miftakhudinov noticed the technician's movement and shouted to him, "Wait," more left at full speed, and confirmed the order with a conditional hand gesture. "Wish me a happy flight," he said to the technician, getting into the cockpit, and he caught his absent, staring somewhere in himself, realized that the pilot's thoughts are already there, in the battle, tearing through the anti-aircraft barrier, attacking the enemy ship. Why did he say that? Well, why? A technician would later ask me. How many times I sent him on a flight, he'd wink and say, "Well, see you later," and off he went. Really, why? ... The visibility was good and the group noticed the convoy from afar. It was at the estimated point, at full speed heading for Gdynia. Act in pairs. Borisov commanded on the radio, together with Kulinik went to the end transport and sank it. Repin and Miftakhutinov attacked a larger steamer, leading the column, and this attack was successful. Who could foresee that this victorious 5th combat sortie will be the last for the glorious crew? Miftakhudinov had already passed over the ship engulfed in flames, but was shot down by anti-aircraft fire from the guard ships. No one will ever be able to tell how it happened, whether both engines crashed at once, whether the pilot was seriously wounded or killed. The sea will keep this secret forever. Having flown another 800 meters, Boston crashed into the water and the grey waves of the Baltic closed over him. the glorious son of Tatarstan Gusman Bikmayevich Miftahudinov, Volga boys Gleb Mikhailovich Lokalov, and Yuri Frolovich Aksanov died the death of heroes, having fulfilled their military duty to the end,